Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Musical Mornings with Rock Island Sound from the Westchester Children's Museum. My name's Andrew, and I'm playing violin today. And just a reminder, if you like what you see and you are interested in taking violin or viola lessons, please call Rock Island Sound at 914-967-0800 or go online to Rock Island Sound's website and you can sign up for lessons, or I'm also doing a fiddle camp with the Rec Center from August 17th to August 20th. So go ahead and you can look at the Rec Center website for those details. All right, so today what we're going to talk about a composer named Beethoven. So in our journeys, we've discovered about Bach, about Vivaldi, and about Mozart. Now Beethoven, we're going to talk about why he's important, some of his compositions for the violin and for overall. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear a little bit of some of his pieces. So, and just a reminder in the comments, just tell me how old everyone is, so I have an idea. All right. So first, I'm going to play a little bit of an excerpt from Beethoven, and probably you've heard this piece before. If you have, let me know in the comments what it is, and we'll see if we can figure it out. All right. So here we go. So I'll give everyone a little bit of time to see if we can figure out what that piece was. While we're waiting, I'll tell you a little bit about Beethoven. So Beethoven, this is a picture of Beethoven, and he was born in the year 1770 in Germany, in the city of Bonn. So all of our composers so far have been either from Germany or Italy or Austria. Mozart was from Austria, Beethoven and Bach from Germany, and Vivaldi's from Italy. So Beethoven, he was an accomplished pianist. So he played the piano. He really didn't play violin. So this is our first composer that we have talked about that really didn't play the violin, but he knew how to write for the violin. He knew other violinists. So he was able to talk to them or ask them questions about, maybe how should I write this effectively for the violin? How does it make it sound like a violin instead of like a piano? So now, one of the things Beethoven is known for is he wrote symphonies, he wrote a lot of concertos, so both for piano, and he wrote a violin concerto, which we'll hear a little bit of a little bit later on. And he also wrote a lot of string quartets. So remember, we talked about in our first video about string quartets being for two violins, viola, the bigger cousin of the violin, and the cello, the one where you sit down and play. So he wrote 16 string quartets, and those are really the first set of string quartets that really defined chamber music and kind of let people play with themselves. Let people play together in their house. So now, no one's been able to guess. So I'll just play the piece one more time that I played in the beginning. So that was a little bit from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And a lot of this is, some people have interpreted that. Some people think that's fate. So like destiny, or like what's going to happen to you, fate knocking at the door with the repeated notes. And what's interesting about this Fifth Symphony is that motive in some way or form comes back throughout the whole symphony, which was kind of unusual for that time. Remember, we talked about a little bit about sonata form and different movements. And usually movements were independent of each other and grouped together in a symphony or a concerto or a quartet. But Beethoven took this motive and put it in the other movements of the piece. The second movement is very lovely, slow movement, but in the background there's that repeated motion in the background. Then the third movement is kind of a scherzo, but the movement again, you hear that ba 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 ba, like in the beginning. And then in the last movement is a triumphant march. But in the accompaniment, in the last part of the last movement, you have that bum 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 bum. Now, so you can hear that throughout, and so it's a thing that unifies, that ties together the whole symphony. Right. So Beethoven lived until 1827, but about halfway through his life, around the mid 1800s, even a little bit earlier than that, Beethoven started to lose his hearing, or he started to go deaf. So as a musician, imagine if you're playing music and you can't hear anything. How could you do that? How could you play or write music without being able to hear? Now, Beethoven, since he had his hearing earlier in his life, so he at least had the sounds in his mind. So he heard these sounds earlier in life, and then when he lost his hearing, he could still hear inside. He just couldn't hear outside. He couldn't hear you and me talking or an orchestra playing. So it's amazing that Beethoven was able to persevere through something that was really could really affect his art and his music, and he was able to overcome that. Now he had to stop performing because that was just too much. But he didn't stop composing, and a lot of his compositions were composed while he was going deaf, and then after he became completely deaf. And one of the pieces that he composed when he was completely deaf was his Ninth Symphony. And his Ninth Symphony, the last movement, has a famous tune which you've all heard before, and I'm going to play it for you. So that we know as Ode to Joy. And his Ninth Symphony is also, it kind of defies the form of symphony because it's the first symphony that uses a choir of voices in the last movement of the symphony. So there's this whole huge symphony. It's also probably the longest symphony in terms of time that somebody has written up to that point. It's almost an hour long. And the first movement is this big movement. The second movement has the big scare. And then the third movement is very, very beautiful, very slow. And then the fourth movement just takes all of those things, presents them, and then Beethoven kind of rejects them and says, "No, this is how we're gonna have the piece go." So it's just amazing that someone can compose something so beautiful when they're overcoming a challenge in their life and overcoming a challenge and persevering. So it's really important that if you feel that no matter what you're experiencing in life, that you can overcome anything if you put your mind to it and you work hard. All right. So now I'm going to play a few more excerpts for you. Now, he wrote a violin concerto. He only wrote one violin concerto, unlike Mozart, our friend Mozart from last week, who wrote 5 violin concertos. Beethoven sometimes worked very methodically. Mozart, remember we talked about Mozart, how he kind of had the music in his head already and then wrote it down. Beethoven would sketch things out. So there are pages and pages and pages of sketchbooks in different libraries and museums where you can see the process that Beethoven went through in writing his music and kind of see how he thought about composing, and he had to write things down and then edit them when he was doing that. So now, this is a little bit of an excerpt from his Beethoven's Violin Concerto. So, if you notice, if you remember our Mozart violin concerto from last week, you notice that the violin was kind of in its middle range for the... So already, this concerto was probably written about 20 years after Mozart's violin concerto, and already you can see that the technique of the violin, so the way we play the violin, has already evolved so that we're using the higher register and coming all the way up there. So I'm going to put some rosin on my bow. Wow, I'm talking. So, so we talk about techniques. So violinists were exploring different ways to play the violin, different maybe higher positions or advanced bowing techniques with double tops. So Beethoven took advantage of these new techniques and incorporated them in his music. So all these high registers. So this high D up here is very, very high register for. So in violin playing in orchestras in that time, maybe he has some third position, maybe up to this D here. So we're getting all this part of the fingerboard now in music. So that was a little bit of an excerpt from his violin concerto. And now before we go, I want to play a little bit of more of an extended excerpt from his Spring Sonata. So we talked about Vivaldi a few weeks ago and tone painting. Now, Beethoven wrote a lot of music just for music's sake, so art for art's sake. There was a piece that he did write called the Pastoral Symphony, his Sixth Symphony, and he actually gave each of the movements titles, just like kind of Vivaldi wrote his poem for each of his four-season concertos. Beethoven wrote a title for each of the movements. So the first movement is Gentle Awakenings of Coming into the Country. So imagine you're going out into the forest or going out into a meadow for the first time. And how would that make you feel, breathing in the fresh air, seeing the trees and the blue sky and the birds? Beethoven... and it just keeps going like that. Then the second movement is actually like a babbling brook. And then in the end of that movement, he actually imitates bird calls with a flute, an oboe, and a clarinet, a nightingale, and then a quail, and then a cuckoo. Which I think we heard a little bit of the cuckoo in Vivaldi too. So bird calls are very prevalent in music. Composers use that a lot because birds are very musical. Their songs are very beautiful. And then there's a thunderstorm movement with lots of rain. And then the last one is kind of a thanks storm for passing, giving us rain, and then just a general Thanksgiving. So he used program music in that instance. Now, this piece, the Spring Sonata, he didn't name it the Spring Sonata. Somebody else afterwards named it because it reminded them of spring. So I'm going to play a little bit for you and want you to see if it reminds you of spring. And try to think back to Vivaldi's Spring. I'll play a little bit of it. So remember Vivaldi's Spring. Remember how he portrayed spring. Now see if you can hear why somebody would think this piece would make you think of spring. So think about what things in here reminded you about spring. You know, one thing that I can kind of see why someone would name this spring song is right in the very beginning, kind of just the way the music flows. It kind of sounds like a little stream as it wakes up from winter, with those 16th notes that are going down. So like that. And then kind of like the birds chirping a little bit. Kind of the, where's that? Like that's kind of like chirp, 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 chirp. And then like that kind of reminds me of birds as well. All right. So thank you everyone for listening in. I hope you've learned a little bit about Beethoven today. And you can join me next week, which is going to be about other styles of how to play the violin. So we've talked a lot about classical composers the last few weeks, but we're going to talk about how other musical styles use the violin, and we'll play some excerpts from that as well. So you can join me next week at 9:30 a.m. for that, and tune in tomorrow at 9:30 for Rachel's singing class. And also remember, if you want to take lessons with me, either on violin or viola, or you're interested in any of the camps that I offer, you can go to rockislandsound.com, or you can go call 914-967-0800. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you next Monday. Bye-bye.